With our scouting meeting in the rearview mirror, Sebastian and I will break down how this kind of goes and what goes on behind the scenes over at Dobber Prospects with the scouting meeting of the November 2024 NHL Draft Rankings. All that's coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi, joined by Sebastian and Hadi. And on today's show, we'll be breaking down some of the kind of discussions that happen behind the scenes of a scouting meeting, especially around these difficult conversations where two players are kind of neck and neck, and how, as a scouting team, we kind of get around the issue of ranking them and in which order. We'll get into that specifically regarding two different comparisons. First and foremost, we've got Berkly Catton versus Cayden Lindstrom, two really good WHLers who really ended up neck and neck in our rankings and among the consensus. We'll also talk about Sam Dickinson versus Zayne Parekh, two OHL defenders who were also pretty close in terms of the comparison on draft day and where they can go. So we'll talk about all that more in detail and kind of break down the differences between them and how we kind of reached a consensus regarding that. We'll also talk through some bullish takes and how we reflect them in our rankings. We'll talk about Tij Iginla, Misa, Cole Hutson, a bunch of players who, a lot of players were banging the table for. A lot of our scouts were banging the table for, and how we make sure to reflect everyone's opinions in the scouting team, within our meeting. So we'll get into that on today's show. Before we get into it, though, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It's always very much appreciated. So, Sebastian, let's get right into it. We'll start talking a bit about kind of how it went. Without giving you any kind of spoilers, this is in the kind of an exclusive look at an exclusive early look at what the rankings are kind of going to look like. But make sure to tune in later this week as the rankings come out. We'll make sure to share them on all socials and make them public for everyone, so you can go ahead and check out what our rankings are to be as a team. But let's start off with kind of the conversation that happened around Berkly Catton versus Cayden Lindstrom, because I think that conversation was really interesting, and I like how we navigated that. In previous years, we probably would have spent 40 minutes just on that conversation. So talk me through what happened there, what we talked about, and what was the consensus at the end of the day.
Yeah, it was a discussion kind of sparked by just how wide open this draft class becomes after multiple different points in the first half of the first round. There are multiple drop-off points in our eyes in value between tiers, and one big one was between 1 and 2. We think that Celebrini is kind of separating himself from the pack a little bit, but we had another one bit further down in our top 10, and Lindstrom and Catton were kind of the two most enthusiastic guys that among our scouting team that we were really, really hyped up for, that we like a lot for multiple different reasons, as will be very, very clear in our ranking meeting, which will be posted. And once it is, I will link it down in the description here. But it was a fascinating debate because it was not one really centered on size versus skill, which you often see between like the big WHL forward versus the small WHL forward. Rather, it was a question of upside versus projectability versus what they've shown so far versus development curves. There were many different arguments that were taking place here, and it made a really interesting argument to have with the entire scouting team involved. I think we had at least 4 or 5 people chiming in with what they've seen from these different players. And in the end, we ended up going for one where we had a slight tinge more popular support, but even then, I think we were pretty much divided down the middle. It was almost a 50-50. But I think in the end, the player that I have higher ended up being second on our board. But as you said, like, these are both players that are going to feature well inside our top 10. And whether or not they are in one order or another when they are back to back in our rankings was not something we really wanted to spend much time on debating, because there isn't that much of a point, especially with an early ranking, of really narrowing it down to individual slots. It's far more about the ranges that players are supposed to be in, and kind of debating those ranges themselves, because as you said, in the past, we have perhaps been a little bit blinded by our desires to get our specific guys into an arbitrary slot, and have spent dozens of minutes arguing over individual slots for players outside the top 10, which, especially for non-final rankings, is a bit tough to rationalize. But it was an interesting debate, as was one that we had even earlier in our meeting, which was Sam Dickinson versus Zayne Parekh, in which Sam Dickinson got most of the popular support in terms of like the time spent in our meeting, but I know that multiple others of us were kind of staying quiet, but kind of cheering on Parekh in that head-to-head battle. But what was your perspective on that specific comparison?
Yeah, I think that, it was pretty spot on in terms of how we kind of discussed it and described it. We're talking about a player in Sam Dickinson that, has everything required in order to have a high-end impact at the NHL level. Defensively, for me, he's one of the best prospects I've ever scouted in terms of his defensive abilities, his ability to close gaps, his stick positioning, his stick control, the aggressiveness with which he plays, and the composure in terms of not throwing himself into every hit, even though he could and it would work given how good at skating and how physically prominent he is on that team. Just the fact that, our OHL scout Jordan Harris brought him up as, a player who carved himself a top 4 role on a team that had multiple high-end veteran pieces. We're talking Isaiah George, Logan Mailloux, Oliver Bonk. I mean, he still managed to not only carve himself a top 4 role, but now that Mailloux is gone, he's become a top pair defender on the London Knights, which it's not your average program. It's a very difficult program to excel in as a defenseman, and to get top minutes in. You need to play a certain way. You need to earn it in a certain way, especially when you have players that are so prominent in terms of veteran presences on that back end. Like I said, with Oliver Bonk there and with Isaiah George there, I expected that to be their first pair, but Sam Dickinson made it very clear that he deserves to be on that. And there are some questions about offensive upside. I'm not as hesitant regarding that. I think that Dickinson is exploring his game in very interesting ways. He's adding a bit more of that long range offense. I've seen more cross rink passes and stretch passes from him as the season has gone on. And on top of that, his small area playmaking is so solid. He has a booming shot. He's not afraid to use it. And, he activates from the offensive zone. He's not kind of magnetically glued to that blue line, which you see a lot from a lot of defensive defensemen usually. He's exploring these areas of his game, so I'm not too concerned about that. So I think that's, that was a separating factor, is that, Zayne Parekh, yes, has improved his game, but Sam Dickinson has such a solid base of skills, and he can just add to that. Kind of like we saw Cayden Lindstrom in his draft year versus right now. Cayden Lindstrom right now is playing like the best Habs defenseman, and there's a reason for that. It's because he's added so many tools to his game over the years. If he was pretty much the same player as in his draft year, he probably would have made the NHL, but would not be as impactful at all as he is right now. So I think that's kind of the blueprint that's being followed for Dickinson. And that's why at the end of the day, he ended up higher. But yeah, I understand the arguments for Parekh. He is mesmerizing with the puck. He's so dynamic, so fluid, so composed. Every pass he makes is accurate and well timed and well managed. So, like, yeah, I'm fine with either one of them. But I feel like at the end of the day, there was a bit more support for Dickinson, and that's how we split it at the end of the day. And especially with our OHL scout Jordan Harris, preferring Dickinson over Parekh, we had to reflect that in our rankings. It's just a matter of respect. His job is to follow that that group. So if he says Dickinson over Parekh, usually if it's tied, we give Harris the final word, or whoever's the regional scout for 2 players. And it was the same for Catton and Lindstrom, right? I mean, Luke Sweeney was banging the table for Catton first. We went with Catton first. So yeah, That wraps things up for our first segment. We'll get into our second segment where we talk about, bullish takes, kind of players that we were banging the table for a bit higher than others. We'll get to that right after these messages from our sponsors over at Game Time. If you're looking for tickets for any event, especially if they're last minute, Game Time is the best place to get them done. I love Game Time mainly because my schedule is very volatile. So, I can find myself with an afternoon free out of nowhere. And it's really important for me to be able to get tickets quickly and reliably to events when I want to, whether that's sporting events like going and watching the Habs at the Bell Center, or anything from, comedy to theater to anything that requires tickets, really. With Game Time, you can get tickets up until the last minute before the event, and even sometimes an hour after it starts. So really reliable and really useful in that sense, especially for people like me who have these kind of schedules that are unpredictable. What's really fun with Game Time is they have a bunch of other deals as well to kind of support you in finding the best tickets for the best price. They got flash deals, they've got zone deals, which I really like, where you pick the row and you pick the section and Game Time picks the seats. That gives you about an average of 18% of savings. And the Game Time guarantee means that you'll always get the best price. So if you find a ticket in the same row and section for less than what Game Time has to offer, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, it's really simple. Just create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Alrighty, so moving on to our second segment, we'll talk a bit about some of the bullish takes we had in this draft, guys that we're higher or lower on, and just overall kind of talking about how we reflect our regional scouts' wishes in these rankings. Because some of the guys that we have on our team have certain guys that we don't really have in that range, but they have them way higher than the rest, and we have to respect that in our ranking. So what we do is we kind of compensate for that by ranking them at a position that makes sense for everyone. For example, we'll start with Tij Iginla. I know you and I saw Tij Iginla as more of a kind of 25 to 32 range pick, a guy that would definitely make the first round, but in a late sense. But yeah, I mean, as the year's gone on, I've grown to like him a bit more. At first, I saw him as a second rounder, but as the year has gone on, I've liked him a bit more. And when we got to the meeting, Luke was like, "Yeah, he needs to be like, he needs to be among the first WHLers off the board once we hit like 15." So we were like, "Oh, okay, let's respect that." So yeah, talk me through how that went, and what the conversation was, because there were 3 or 4 WHLers in this kind of batch of players. And yeah, how did we end up kind of splitting hairs on that?
Yeah, this entire situation was sparked when we hit 15th overall, and we had
Yeah.
about like 5 names that we could have put in a blender and been pretty okay with.
Yeah.
And I think it probably took us like 5 to 10 minutes to actually get that all sorted. That was one of the speed bumps that we hit in our meeting. That took a little bit longer because like the draft really opens up after the top 15 in our eyes. And
Yeah.
yeah, like it was a back and forth. I know, like I myself was pumping the tires of guys like Luke Misa in this range, and you were kind of going for Tarek Parasak, but
Yeah.
Luke, having watched WHL a ton and constructing a pretty sound argument for Tij Iginla in that range, we were quite happy to kind of just go with it, because at least my mantra with scouting meetings in general and being part of a scouting team, especially with early season rankings, is to trust in the team. There's no point in having a scouting team if this is going to be a thing where I, or the two of us as like kind of the head scouts, try to veto arguments of our scouting team. Like, our role is to mediate discussion, try to give direction to meetings, ask the right questions, make sure everyone can get involved, rather than like really constructing the skeleton of the rankings. That's not our role. Our role is to kind of allow discussion to flourish, and that's the beauty of it, right? That like there'd be no point in working as part of a team if you weren't trying to get everyone's voices heard and represented in our rankings. So the fact that Tij Iginla cracked our top 20 is indicative of us having varying opinions within our scouting staff, and that is the beauty of scouting and the debate that we were able to have in this field. So I really enjoy those moments in our meetings where we have some contention, because that's where I feel like scouting arguments shine the brightest. You can really kind of make a stand for the players you believe in. And that was another thing that I felt was important, was to communicate to everyone. If you've got a guy that you just like a ton for whatever reason, bring up the name. Like, the first meeting of the year is the one to make those statements. There are fewer repercussions if they don't end up being first or second round caliber talents come draft day, because it's the first ranking of the year, right? We have bigger leeway for mistakes. But just as in like developing young prospects, I want us to kind of lean into those mistakes and lean into those hotter takes and taking those risks, especially early on in the season when it doesn't matter as much, because it would be very, very boring to have a scouting team where we were just kind of looking at consensus and echoing everything. That we wouldn't be adding anything to this discussion, and it'd be way more boring to take part in those meetings. So, I really actually enjoyed those debates that we had around players like Tij Iginla, for instance.
Yeah, for sure. And I really like how there was just a big batch of WHLers here. We had Ryder Ritchie, Tij Iginla, Tarek Parasek, Tanner Howell, as 4 WHLers that are pretty much neck and neck with a couple other names. And that was kind of the big glut of players we could have blended in, and we would have been fine. And along with Adam Yurachek, maybe even Arn Kiviharu could be in that conversation as well. But yeah, it was a very interesting kind of batch of players, and I like how we kind of ended up with consensus on that. We really kind of leaned in on Luke's thoughts on this, because I've also watched a lot of WHL, and I probably would have had it in a different kind of direction. But like you said, our role is to make sure that we surround our team with the best support possible, and we take the word into consideration. And especially when guys have a specific name above another, like Tij Iginla, that's part of the conversation. And that brings us to Luke Misa. Luke Misa is an incredibly speedy, incredibly pacey, incredibly skilled player who, even though the puck skills aren't all there, I mean, he's got such a solid foundation of skills, and everything he does is done at such a high speed, not just because he plays fast, not just because he skates fast, but because he plays and thinks fast. And that combination really put him in this conversation. I mean, from what I understand, you at this, before we headed into this scouting meet, you were under the impression that you would have to bring up Luke Misa at 20. And we were already talking about him earlier than that. So that was really interesting, I feel. And Luke Misa is the type of player that you can kind of see end up in this range, but this is the reflection of what we were talking about in previous episodes about, the first ranking of the year is really just so that you can showcase that you like a certain guy more than consensus, and sort of bang the table for him. And I feel like that was the case for Luke Misa, because at the end of the day, if Luke Misa ends up having a poor second half of the year and ends up off the first round board, no one really looks back at the November rankings with any seriousness. But if he ends up continuing to play the way he has and improves his game and ends up in the top 15 on everyone's rankings, we can kind of look back and see, we had him there first, that kind of thing. So that's one player that I kind of bring that caveat to, because it's really important to make that distinction. I think it's really important to rank players based on how you like them earlier in the year,
For sure.
and then as the year goes on, you solidify the rankings.
Especially in this draft class too. Like, I think one of the big topics in our meeting was that I think everyone was a little bit surprised by how big of a wall we hit at like 14th overall. We hit a massive wall where I think we as a team collectively realized at the same time just how big of a drop off there is between like 14 and 15, where there is a player that we kind of just slot in at 14 by necessity that nobody was particularly enthusiastic about in that range, but there just weren't any other names. I think that this draft definitely lacks top 20 talent outside the top 10. And also one of the reasons that we're kind of able to make pretty bullish takes on players we like a lot, because there weren't necessarily those stalwarts that like hogged up those 10 to 20 ranking slots as they usually do. And instead it felt like we jumped from like top 12 talents to top 25 talents in one pick. And when it opened up that way, I told everyone, like, if you've got a guy, now's the time already. Like, you might have them written down as like a 20 to 30 range player, but we have nobody enthusiastically banging the table for anyone right now, so it's wide open. And that's how we kind of got some fun bullish takes in here, which I think made the meeting more exciting, a bit more unpredictable. And it's also what is kind of fun with the first meeting of the year. We didn't have a default ranking to kind of go back on and edit, and it's our first one that we've built this season. So there's a lot more intrigue and mystique into how it would actually form up, which was quite fun.
Yeah, absolutely. That wraps things up for our second segment. We'll head into our third, where we talk about some more kind of bullish takes, including the one and only Cole Hutson. We'll get into those kind of discussions and breakdowns right after these messages from our sponsors over at FanDuel.
Score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's right, $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking of joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use, and you can use your bonus bets on anything, ranging from spreads to player props to over and unders and more. Whether you want to bet on your favorite team to win the Super Bowl or on your least favorite team to miss the playoffs, the choice is yours with FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL.
Alrighty, so ending things off with our final section here, we'll continue on our kind of bullish takes kind of run. We'll get into Cole Hutson here first and foremost, because I think that this was kind of an interesting one. I'm still on the fence with Cole Hutson, but I think that 20 to 25 is perfectly the range that I would be comfortable with Hutson. So we won't tell you exactly where he ended up, but it's somewhere in that range. With Hutson, he was a player that you had to bring up. We were talking about some different players and where we wanted to rank him and all that, and rank them and all that stuff. And we kind of let go of the Hutson situation until you brought it up. So talk me through that and how important it was for you to have him at this range here.
Yeah, I was keeping an eye on Hutson for a while, probably like as soon as we started our discussion of it's wide open now is when I started thinking of Cole Hutson in that mid-teens range. But Cole Hutson has played far from a perfect season so far and has a plethora of developmental hurdles that he's going to have to overcome. But especially in a draft class like this year's, where there is a real lack of elite high-end skill outside the top 10, I really couldn't justify us dropping him outside the top 25. And once we got towards the tail end of that range, I felt the need to kind of put my foot down and be like, this is the Cole Hutson range in this draft class. And I was expecting a little bit of opposition, maybe, just because of how, black and white his game is in many ways, and how frustrating and concerning that can be. But surprisingly, got quite little opposition there, and I think everyone kind of agreed, like, yeah, this is like, once we were getting into some names that didn't even crack our top 32 and they were kind of being mentioned, I was like, yeah, it's Cole Hutson time. And I think with that amount of skill in this draft class, it would be difficult to rank him outside of that range. And I wanted to make sure that if he gains some form this season, that we don't have to rise him up by like 10 to 15 to 20 slots on our board to get him to a respectable range.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fully agreed. Also want to talk a bit about Matvei Shuravin, an MHL defender who neither one of us really had in their first round. But Graham, our Russia scout, who unfortunately couldn't make the meeting, but still sent in his ranges for these Russian players, really was adamant on having him as kind of a 10 to 20 range player. We ended up not going that high on him, but just as a respect for Graham's wishes and how he sees this player, we still ended up ranking him a bit lower than that, but still within a respectable range. So, Sharavin's an interesting player for me so far. I see a lot of composure, a lot of poise, but not a lot of skill that can surround that composure and poise with kind of a solid base of abilities, to showcase how calm he is with the puck. But he's an interesting player, and I think that 25 is decent enough. And we'll definitely talk to Graham a bit more to have his take on having Shuravin 10 to 20, because isn't that a bit high? Do you feel like that's a bit high? I feel like it's a bit high.
It's higher than I'm comfortable doing right now. That said, if if the consistency of his decision making and the level of his intelligence in terms of creating advantages on every single shift in the KHL, if that's consistent this season, I'm totally happy with that range. I haven't seen enough yet. I mean, he's only played 2 games so far this season in the KHL, logging over 10 minutes, and I've watched both, and he looked good in both.
Yeah.
It's still a pretty small sample, and I think that there are other players with which we had a larger sample whose skill sets are less specialist. Whereas with Shuravin, the only way he's going to really be an impactful NHLer is if his brain carries him all that way and his tools can take a couple of steps to catch up. But I really didn't mind having him in the, like, probably more 20 to 25 range, but like I didn't mind that at all personally. I think when I saw that Graham had him ranked that highly, I felt valid a little bit with my past viewings that have impressed me, even though I'm left slightly skeptical based on the consistency issues, which we talked about in an episode last week. But no, it was a really interesting one because it was also a bullish stance, and we were at a point in our meeting where nobody had any bullish takes left. Like we got past all of those by like when we got to like 24 probably with Cole Hutson. And beyond that point, it was kind of just a thing of like, okay, we've got to plug in some names here. We had a list of players. Like I had probably 2 other guys I wanted to get in apart from Shuravin, but with Graham's a strong stance on Shuravin, we plugged him in, and I'm actually quite happy that he cracked the top 32 because I think the intelligence and even in a tiny sample, the KHL success is very impressive. So I quite liked that as a take.
Yeah, for sure. I think another wall we hit was once we hit kind of the 30 range because
there's
a lot of names. Yeah, that's the main issue is that like there's a bunch of names that we could have in the first round, but like in any other draft year, they probably wouldn't be. And that was kind of the hard thing with this kind of range.
Yeah.
I think Henry Muse would be the only one. Yeah.
Muse was the one that I was like, we're getting him in somehow. I've watched like every single home game he's played in the OHL live. Like I need this guy inside the top 32. But as you were saying, like in past drafts, once we hit like 30 to 32 range, you have every single scout frantically trying to get their guy into that board.
Just kind of shoving him in the first round. Just like get in there.
Yeah. It's like under any circumstance. So last year for me, that was Luca Pinelli. I was like, doesn't matter. Luca Pinelli is getting in the early season boards. And that's what I was kind of expecting coming into this meeting. But as I said, I think everyone was kind of like collectively surprised as to how unenthusiastic most of us were for very specific prospects. And when we hit like 29 to 32, like it was really just a thing of we had to plug in some names that were like, like their range goes up into the first round. Therefore, I guess we'll put them in here. Whereas in the past, it has really been like enthusiastic, loud banging on the table for specific players, which we saw a lot less of in our first meeting, which I think is indicative of how we feel of the draft class as a whole.
Yeah, and I feel like the main thing with this kind of range was like, there were players that we were considering that even the regional scouts were considering that they were just like, this guy sucks. And we had to consider players that the regional scout did not like. So at the end of the day, it was just like, yeah, exactly. So at the end of the day, for like our idea was just, we'll rank them in the top 32 if you're just kind of meh on them. If you don't like this player, we'll make the statement of putting him in the honorable mentions. But it was that weird of an end of draft here. So it's going to get a bit more solidified as the year goes on and as we pick up on these gems that aren't talked about too much yet. And as players kind of solidify.
I'm hoping there are many. I'm hoping there's going to be like 5 to 10 gems that rise up because the enthusiasm I think was more applicable for like the 40 to 50 range that we were showing for like the late 20s. So
absolutely. Alrighty, so that ends things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you like what you've been watching, make sure to like and subscribe and leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. If you're watching on YouTube, of course, and if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. We've got all your news and updates about what's going on in sports, and make sure to tune in for tomorrow's episode as we kind of give you a preview and an idea of what to expect in terms of our Dobber Prospects 2024 NHL Draft Rankings, the first one of the draft year. This has been Hadi with Sebastian and Hadi, and we hope you tune in next time.